Welcome back to From Pain to Gain. We have a very specific, painful topic today, but it's the title of the show, so we don't shy away from this stuff. Abortion, why both parties have it wrong. We're talking about a real gnashing of teeth issue. People are really struggling with this. So, first of all, let's pause and grieve with those folks that struggle with this decision day to day. Uh, all right. So, there's a lot of different parental scenarios that play out of this sensitive issue. I haven't had to deal with it myself, but we're going to add a lot of perspective to it. And we're also going to, towards the end of this intro, explain what our goal of this is. The pain could be from just not even knowing where money will come from to feed their children. If you're making minimum wage, how is that even feasible? I know even people that make over 80 grand a year that struggle to, put food on the table because, they've maybe over leveraged themselves or something like that. But think about the other side of it too, right? You're working at McDonald's, you're making $7.50 an hour. How are you going to put food in your own mouth, much less your own child? So,
And I would make a note, just there's an interesting connection between that and hope, our belief in having hope and our belief in being despairing. So, so that's an interesting dynamic that I think is worth noting. Despair and hope.
Yeah, just really taking a deep dive into that. And, we're just trying to take a deep dive into understanding and just talking about the issue. We don't have it all figured out, but what we see is it's something everybody wants to actively avoid, talking about this difficult conversation. So the point of this entire channel is to talk about difficult conversations, so it's not so, taboo, like, oh, stay away from that. Because staying away from stuff like this is exactly the type of way that'll keep you in pain and in a cycle of pain. What about the specific parties? Why both parties have it wrong? Well, the right, the political right, they're too focused on the birth of the child and not much past the birth, without considering a variety of the other socioeconomic pressures or the fact that they can do an abortion without government support. So that's the right side. Jason, did you have any thoughts on that before I go on to the left?
Yeah, I would simply bring out a quote from just a passage from Alistair McIntyre, which he argues that a state that outlaws abortion, but then fails to provide basic medical and maternity care as well as economic provisions, exemplifies the same individualistic ethos centered on eliminating negative prohibitions, but not aimed at achieving the common good. And so we need to think about the life of a child from conception to them becoming a young adult, and to focus on one part of that while neglecting all the others is to have an ethic that is incomplete. And so that would be one layer that I would add to that. And then the other layer would be the realization that there's some comparisons between other countries where abortion is illegal and the abortion rates are at a similar level as they are in America. And so abortions can still happen whether they're legal or illegal. If I care about the life of the child, I should care that those children are living and flourishing, not whether the law is against or for it. So what can we do to actually save those children? And perhaps from the rights perspective, we could actually be doing things that could eliminate or diminish the number of abortions, even if it were in a society where it is legal. And so that would be a few layers to add to the piece of the pie.
Yeah. And that was, how this entire topic came about, by the way, was I was absolutely flabbergasted at the Supreme Court decision, even when it was not decided, right? We got that leak ahead of time earlier this year, which sparked in me a fire of like, yo, y'all are just throwing out the kitchen sink and not giving a crap about anybody's perspective on this, just kind of forcing people into a perspective. And I had some good group conversations. Jason, you were a part of the first one I had, of course, because you're a wise dude. And one powerful statement that you said coming out of that was, why are we focused on like the birth of a child when it could be thrown into a meat grinder right after? Like, what about, the issues surrounding after the birth, right? So that kind of speaks to what you just talked about, the right. They don't really focus after that. They actively are concerned about how we could crush the poverty and how we could crush lower income folks and remove every sort of way they have support, instead of they're not looking at it from the full picture per se.
Yeah, and I would say there definitely is differentiation between different segments of the pro-life movement in the population in America. But I think it's important to think about what we prioritize and how we prioritize it as in terms of identifying what we actually value. So if you look at a lot of the legislation that has popped out, so one of the things with the abortion situation with the Supreme Court is that it essentially pushed the issue back to the states. It removed, it sort of undid a ruling that had been 50 years ago, and it pushed it back to the states. But the issue hasn't been resolved. Now it's just a matter of 50 states figuring out what they're going to do, and they're going to go in different directions. And if you look at a lot of the legislation that's being proposed, a lot of it is around restricting and eliminating abortion. But how much of the legislation is about actually dealing with the root issues of why people are having abortions? Romney has a really interesting child care plan to address child poverty. And it's those types of plans that seem to be getting pushed down or ignored in favor of these anti-abortion bills. So in terms of just the prominence of them, we'll see what happens in terms of which ones are actually voted on and passed and where things go. But I think it's important to just recognize where we put our energy, and whether we're dealing with and resolving the root issue, or whether or not we're just doing surface level things that make us feel good and give us dopamine hits.
Yeah, and I commend the right on that side, I guess, even though it's just one guy doing it, having a more full circle type laws and supportive systems around it. Before I move on to the left, I do want to quickly just say that there were actually 63 million babies that were murdered, or I guess killed by abortion. So that I learned about that about a month ago, and I was surprised at how big that number was in the last 50 years. So moving on to the
our entire society could be dramatically different with that many more people in it for a variety of reasons. So
I guess to speak to that, the fear I had with the major fear I had with that is there was a correlation statistically that 20 years from Roe v. Wade being passed, there was a dramatic downshift in crime. I think some people were saying as far as 50% down. And so there was no direct correlation, but I was concerned, like, hey, if you're going to force people into having babies, we might have a massive spike in crime later. But since then, I've had quite a more nuanced and different perspective of how to look at that. So we could jump into that as we go through it too. So moving on to the left political party. So they're too focused on the pursuit of happiness and personal autonomy without considering the obligations to each other. For example, the mother making the decision on behalf of a child that has no decision-making capability. Jason, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I would say the focus on the focus on outlawing abortion as a hyper-focused tunnel vision type of idea is just as individualistic in terms of its ethic as the individualistic mindset of it's my body and my right and I can do with it that I want to. And so it's to make a decision that is not considering the other person in the decision, which in this case would be the baby. Now, there would be some on the left that would argue that when does life begin, right? And there's that debate, and so they may not see it that way. But I think that individualistic mindset can certainly permeate us, and it does in a lot of different ways. It's like, I'm not willing to do something. I'm not willing to sacrifice personally for the benefit of someone else. I'd rather do what I want at the cost of somebody else. And so, so that individualistic, that autonomous self is based upon some fundamental assumptions and beliefs. And what I would kind of lean into is like, what is the basis of our morality and our ethics? Is it come from me as an individual, or is there a transcendent source of morality of which I'm attempting to align with? And so the autonomous self would essentially make the argument that I am the ultimate authority and I get to dictate what is right and wrong. And so if I say this is right or it's not wrong, then it is not wrong. But as someone who believes that morality comes from a transcendent source, God, I instead have to go, well, what does God have to say about this, and how does God see this, and wrestle through that to come to a conclusion, versus just me coming arbitrarily to my own decision based on my own preferences or my own experiences or whatnot. Does it make sense?
Yeah, for sure. What two things that really opened my mind to a different perspective on this versus my furiousness about somebody telling a woman what to do with their body. Number one, a crime that occurred where a pregnant woman was killed. And so the question becomes, should the murderer be charged with two charges of murder, or one? And so I'm pretty sure universally everybody would say it would be two, no matter if the baby was 1 day old in her womb or, 1, 3, 9 months. I think that's pretty universally accepted. So that kind of blew my mind when a friend of mine had it look at me that way in terms of that crime. And then the other thing, where I was studying the Bible on specific stuff like this, and the verse that made it absolutely simplified, although there's exceptions, I still feel, to making an abortion happen. The thing that made it crystal clear for me was this verse that says, "I knew you in the womb," and it doesn't say, "I knew you in the womb," at 9 months or 3 months. It's basically, that's totalitarian. 1 second, one cell being made into a baby, and so that's what kind of had me having a different perspective on it. And then of course there's also, just having a control over your body of, just having protected sex. That's another feasible thing that people could avoid, having to even consider abortion through. So before we kind of go into the last couple points here, I did want to actually introduce Ross. So I haven't even mentioned him. In order to simplify kind of this very deep and intricate perspective, he's actually drawing out kind of full-fledged diagram of this entire episode. So,
hi guys.
Hey.
Thanks for having me. This is fun.
Thanks.
Watch you guys battle it out.
Yeah. Glad to have you here. I do want to make one note on the pregnancy murder being 2 versus abortion not being considered murder. It implies that we have an ethic that a person is of value when they are wanted, right? So if someone is wanted, which in the case of an undesired murder, would, that would be considered murder. But if they don't want the child, in the case of abortion, then it's unwanted. And so in that situation, the person is not of value. Now, I think that's just an interesting dynamic to consider. Is that the ethic that we want to define? Who is a person and whether or not they are valued as a society? or not. And so I think that's in the implication. Now, someone might make the argument that that's pro-choice. They might make the argument again that, well, it's not murder because life doesn't start until a certain age, and they might say if it's before that amount of time in the womb, whether it's murder or abortion, it's whether someone takes the life through in the case of the example you gave versus an abortion, there's no difference because the fetus is not yet a baby, is what they would sort of make that argument. And so you can kind of look at it a couple different ways, and people make those arguments. I think it's important to see things how they see them, even if we disagree. I think we're, as Christians, we ought to be generous in understanding the different points of view and representing them fairly, versus trying to straw man them and make them seem like they're horrible, because we're not going to persuade anyone, which I think a lot of this has to do with really persuading people through our actions and our words towards, like I mentioned, the common good, towards a better way forward, towards a better form of flourishing that all of us can partake of, not just select few. And so thinking about it in that way, I think, is important. And then the other thing I would kind of more fundamentally kind of bring out is, think about that, when a baby is conceived, that egg is fertilized, and that it's transforming into a baby that's going to be born, and then that child is going to grow up into an adult, right? And so to think about whatever stops that is a problem that we should be looking at, and abortion is one of those biggest stop points, right? It's to say that I want to stop this child from becoming what they ought to become, what they deserve to become. And we can kind of talk more about that, and even the power dynamics that this child is completely dependent on the mother and its community and its society to be born and to become a productive member of society. And if someone decides to end its life, it has no choice in the matter. It has no the power dynamic is so lopsided that the child is forced to go along with it, and that's an important dynamic to consider.
Yeah. You mentioned a straw man. Like, who's a man carrying around straws? Like, that's just weird.
Yeah, a straw man would be like making an argument.
I know, come on, Jason, it's a bad joke.
Yeah, for those that don't know. The opposite would be steel manning. Like, hey, what's the strongest argument that they're making, and trying to present it that way. So,
okay.
Yeah. So we got steel and straw.
So wherever you stand on this, our goal is not to tell you you're wrong, like a lot of everybody out there, I'm sure, is doing. The goal of the issue is to eliminate kind of following a group about this matter, the left, the right, the middle, outside, peripheral, because it's so easy to follow behind a group on this matter, especially the left or the right, because it's the massive, forms of our population. Just look at, the outrage following group situation that happened on January 6th. So that's not what this is. We're not trying to go into justifying something based on following a group. Look at how many Christians justified slavery because they were following a group. This is not what we're doing here.
Yeah, and so I definitely want to press into that and really kind of lean into this idea that our superpower as humans is to justify what we're doing as good, even when it's wrong. So I think as a baseline, we have to recognize that that's our propensity. And so we are dependent on each other to rationalize towards what is good. And we also have the propensity to rationalize horrible things. We often use ideologies to do this, to justify that what I'm doing is not just wrong, but it's a good thing. And so a lot of the human atrocities that have been committed over the years and over the centuries and over the millennium has been based on people believing these ideologies that inform that what they're doing is a good thing. It's a just thing.
Yeah.
It's
like the Holocaust.
But it may not be. And so I think we have to recognize our propensity in order to, one, question ourselves and each other, and to figure out how do we align with a transcendent good. If it's ultimately just about individual, what I think is good and what you think is good, and we're all just sort of fighting amongst each other, it ultimately comes down to a power battle. Whoever's the strongest is going to get to dictate their preference. Mm-hmm. And so, but I think it's important to recognize that. And I do want to just bring a quick example in terms of the Holocaust, in terms of the World War II. This is a passage from a book called Ordinary Men, which is about these men that became Nazi killers of Jews. And this is how one of the ways that one of them rationalized what he was doing as a good thing, just to give a specific example. So this is a quote from him. He said, "I made the effort, and it was possible for me to shoot only children. It so happened that the mothers led the children by the hand. My neighbor then shot the mother, and I shot the child that belonged to her. Because I reasoned with myself that, after all, without its mother the child could not live any longer, it was supposed to be, so to speak, soothing to my conscience to release the children unable to live without their mothers." The full and then he gives a little commentary, the author. "The full weight of the statement and the significance of the word choice of the former policeman cannot be fully appreciated unless one knows that the German word for release also means to redeem or save, when used in a religious sense. The one who releases is the savior or redeemer." So he was justifying himself by shooting the child as seeing himself as the savior and redeemer, which we would look at it and say is horrible. And so I think it's just a really important point for us to recognize our propensity to justify, and that our justification can be done in a very morally wrong way. And to have that question about ourselves is important, so that we can actually have the rational debate about it and explore the different options, and also be generous with each other in that discussion. Does that make sense?
For sure, man. Like you said, the brain could justify anything, which is why we have to have these conversations. The Bible verse comes to mind: "Do not conform any longer to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind." If you're not actively renewing your mind, then you're just kind of floating into the cultural realities of this world. And so, speaking about just talking about this stuff, that's one of the other goals of this episode, just talking about it so it's less hostile. You know, an alcoholic has to come to grips when they want to recover with talking about their issues and not having judgment around it. And in the same way, we have an addiction to outrage in our culture. If we can't talk about it like normal human beings, without threatening each other, without violence, then we can't move on to the next phase of, making this ourselves better, our society better, villages, etc. If you can't talk to someone about abortion without fear of dying, then we'll never overcome it. Having a neutral arena to talk about this is key, and that's what this is all about. Now, to talk more about some other aspects of this, I guess this is kind of more on the left. Sex is placed above discipline as a virtue. When in reality, sex is just like a dopamine rush giving thing, like ice cream. You can't really say that my urgency for ice cream is a virtue. In the same way, you can't say sex is a virtue. If just to tie that into more of our perspective as believers, if there's no God, then free liberty to do anything, free liberty of even virtue, and the definition of virtue makes sense. But if your God is Jesus, we're encouraging you to look at this at more holistic way versus not. Versus even just following the right or the left. Christian on the right, look at this at a full circle versus a hard stance of it must stop right now, 1 minute from now, or I'm going to start hitting people. Christians on the left, look at this matter as a matter of dependence, and our choices impact other people. Therefore, both are wrong, so we have to come back to Jesus. Jason, before we start to jump into the beat of this, the CAGE acronym, any other thoughts you want to add to the intro?
Yeah, I think it's, there's definitely a lot we can explore. I think we've talked about this idea of our superpower to justify. um, whether or not there is a transcendent good, or whether we just have our own goods and we're just fighting for those. Whether we're aligning with the transcendent good if it does exist, whether we're dependent creatures or autonomous creatures. What do we owe each other? Do we owe each other anything? Do I owe this child anything? Does this child owe me anything? Um, does my community owe me anything, or is am I an island of which community is simply a transaction of I give and you receive and vice versa, and there's no duty beyond that. So I think some of those ideas are really the underlying pieces of this. There's also responsibility in terms of sexual relations inside or outside of marriage, and how that has an effect. But a lot of abortions do happen within marriage, so it's not just a marriage issue. But that dynamic, and then you also have when you do have sexual relations, are you using birth control or not? And is that more important or less important than abortion? And how did those play out, and how did those sort of inform how we see things, both in negative and positive ways? But ultimately, the nature of what is a child for, and where does it come from, in terms of its sort of it's the relationship. It's a loving relationship, sexual relationship that gives life, right? And so why is that relationship, why does the family matter? What is the purpose of family? How does it play a role in community? How does it play a role in society? And how do these sort of pieces of the puzzle come together? Or are they just individual modules unconnected to each other? Or are they connected? So I'm sort of throwing these questions out there, and these kind of poles on different spectrums, just to get us thinking about the root issues that we're exploring. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Power differentials would be another one.
When you mentioned what is
right?
owed, when you mention what is owed, one could easily say, as a man, you owe a child 18 years of your life at a minimum, because you knew what you were getting into when you're having unprotected sex.
Mm-hmm. And we may be connecting, we may be participating in something without the commitment of that 18 years.
Right.
And so there's a disconnect. And I would call that there's something wrong there, because it doesn't align with the transcendent good. And so if I'm conducting behavior that is neglecting the responsibility, then there's a problem that we need to talk about.
Yeah. And on the opposite side of that, a woman accepting that is also another degree of responsibility, right? If you wanted to have unprotected sex with a man, are you accepting it maybe because of fear of something? Is that something you got to address? Maybe have therapy about, like fearing the rejection of men because they're not good for you, or they just want to have sex with you. Those are deeper topics outside of this, but it's like other things that may not want to be directly addressed too.
Yeah, and then you also have, what does the community owe them, and what does society owe them, and the community. If someone neglects their responsibility, the community should move heaven and earth to step in and fill that void, and the society should. If the community fails to do that, the society should step in and do the same. And so we should have, again, to move towards this common good, we should have an ecosystem that, when there is failure on any one part, it doesn't break the system. The system is self-healing and injects a way to fill those gaps.
Right. Okay. So let's jump into complacency. So the few kind of points here is inconsistent socioeconomic issues, lack of sexual discipline, which we just kind of talked about, lack of mentoring, and lack of imagination. So the lack of socioeconomic or inconsistent socioeconomic issues, lack of proper affordable housing, which is what my company focuses on, jobs, education, which leads naturally to crime from a cycle of poverty and rejection, not dealing with the root causes of these issues, just kind of putting Band-Aids on them.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. What are your thoughts on those, Jason?
Well, I'll dive into mass into imagination. And I'm going to quote a Alistair McIntyre philosopher again. What is owed to the child? As far as possible, a particular kind of family life. A family life with unconditional bonds, for without them, a child cannot have the kind of security it needs. A child has to be in a family where the parents are to give the children the attention they deserve and are able to provide the children with what they need. So I think one of my criticisms with the pro-life movement is its, in my opinion, its lack of imagination as a whole. Now, there are some good examples of the imagination. But in my mind, I'm thinking, if you really want to stop abortion, is picketing at an abortion clinic really going to make that much of a difference? Perhaps we could spend that same energy in a more creative way that actually has an impact. Now, Gabe Lyons, he's one example of this. Him and his wife found out they were having a child with Down syndrome, and I think 90% of children with Down syndrome have an abortion, or it's a really high number if I'm off the mark. But and he was pretty stunned by that number, and I think it kind of goes back to that comment about our societal ethic is in terms of when people are valuable is based on whether they're wanted or not, and so what he did is he actually created a marketing campaign, and he created these messages and these brochures, and he started giving them to doctors' offices and different places. And what he wanted to do is paint the life of having a child with Down syndrome and how beautiful it was and how wonderful it was. And yeah, there are some challenges and difficulties, but that person is still a person and they're still valuable, and they have lots to teach me just as much as I have to teach them. And not to see myself as above them or below them, but to see myself as the same as them. And I think that's something we have as humans struggle to do. We don't want to see ourselves in someone that's disabled. We don't want to see ourselves in someone that is dependent or needy or is weak, right? We'd rather be associated with strong and healthy, right? But it's in those that are in those places and in those situations that we get to see a side of our humanity that maybe we want to ignore instead. So I think with imagination, I just think about, like, we've spent 50 years trying to undo Roe v. versus Wade. What did we really accomplish? Because looking at the stats, the abortion rate is now what it was before Roe v. Wade. Okay, so we've gone in a big circle. We're back to where we started. And I'm thinking maybe we could have spent those 50 years a little bit different if we'd been more creative and really focused on the lives, the conception, the baby being developed and then born, and then the life of those children after birth. Perhaps we could have done things in the last 50 years that could have actually made a difference, so that when this change in Roe v. Wade happened, it would have just been a formality of a trend that had already been in the works for the prior 60 years. So those are a few thoughts that come to mind.
Yeah, Republicans say they're all about cutting budget and saving the economy by, doing things that are beneficial to business and things like this. But statistically, over the last 40 years, they've actually, if not added a little bit more to the deficit, done things to actively hinder the deficit from decreasing. So that sort of lie I also wanted to pin on the right has been perpetrated, and people just kind of vote for their side because they say they do things, but they actually don't. The statistics prove otherwise.
What I would add, though, is I think on the right side of things, there is a tendency to want to address these issues in a private manner, in a privatized manner, in the market versus through the government, and through private, nonprofits, community groups, and whatnot. And I think that can be useful, and I think that can help stop gaps. There is a scale problem. Like, how do you address some of these issues at scale, without the involvement or at least partnership with government?
I think
some of those
giving tax breaks to billionaires, though, is the way to do that in terms of privatizing and reducing tax liability to benefit the rich.
Yeah, in terms of, that gets back to that autonomous spirit, that that's really the left and the right are both the same in terms of autonomy. We're both we just manifest it in different ways. And so, what do the wealthy owe the poor? Right? What is their duty and obligation, responsibility,
Yeah.
and how does that play out? And I think when it gets to society starts to shake when the disparity grows too much between the wealthy and the
Yeah.
poor.
I just
And
feel if the wealthy isn't putting their at least more than zero in, which is what a lot of these rich people, they don't have to pay anything, um, then the kind of services, the full circle services that lower income people could really depend on to have a full circle to be able to raise a child if they're working in McDonald's or something like that. Or maybe they have a condition to where they can't work effectively to raise a family. That would be able to be uh, more better sustained. Um, I'll give you an example.
okay,
Something that actually both sides have been able to work on is these light tech credits, which is low income housing tax credits. For the last 20 or something years, like that, it's been a partisan issue. Both sides have supported the laws for it, and it's actually supported 2.3 million affordable housing units over the last, again, it has to be 20 years at least, probably more. But it's since that's my sector, affordable housing, I actually don't even use government support to do it.
mm-hmm.
But I will say the complexity, the bureaucracy, the amount of numbers involved just to be able to do that light tech stuff is ridiculous. And so I feel if there had more support, maybe more of a tax base thrown in there, that could be a way of naturally providing these other ancillary services to people that need it. Because in terms of just money lost to affordable housing, that by itself, it costs about $2 trillion a year to the U.S. economy. So I feel it should be less complicated and more government support. Even dollars should be put into that too, and that could be something that could be, again, done in different ways instead of cutting. Let's think about how many things we could cut as fast as possible. Creative ways to do that from a tax-based perspective, and how it ties into complacency. We've gotten so addicted to outrage that both parties actually are caught up in inaction and complaints. So that's a complacency of just not wanting to do anything or acting based on being upset instead of moving society forward. I went to a affordable housing conference earlier this year, and the most disgusting thing I've ever heard in my life. Uh, the city was reaching out to state legislators, which are predominantly Republican in that time period, and they were asking for more of these light tech credits to be able to, in their cities, have more of it. And because of all the election stuff going on, these state legislators were actively uh, cutting down the support that was already allotted for the year. So they were weaponizing politics to hurt people's lives at scale. And I just wanted to punch somebody of like, you guys don't understand how this affects people. Like, affordable housing is the number one cause of inflation.
Yeah, feels like they're just playing a game, and
Yeah,
it really affects people. Yeah,
yeah. It makes me think of how the word woke is weaponized on news and by politics. I'm like, you guys don't understand. Woke means, at its essence, of being awakened to all the atrocities that our country has done. It doesn't mean, hey, white person, you're a bad person. It means, hey, we got some dark stuff in our past. Period. Just recognize it instead of kind of throwing it on the rug and saying everything's fine, everything's great. Our country's perfect, our economy's perfect, and what we did in the past is the past. Leave it there. So it just annoys me when the word woke is used to. It's even been taken in by the LGBT. They just kind of took it into their reins, and I'm like, you guys just took it away from black people that deserve it a whole lot more for the last 400 years than what you
yeah.
guys.
We like to take things and then use them, regardless of where we got them.
Yeah.
But I think just in terms of a couple, I wanted to read a couple passages from Thomas Oden. He wrote a book called Care of the Souls in the Classic Tradition. If you counsel people, like, it's a great book. You can find a copy of it online for free and it got published in 1984, and I think it went out of print. But it's really about the tradition of counseling Christian through the Christian tradition since the early Christian church, and and he kind of pulls it together and then applies some modern principles into that. But there's a section he talks about the rich and the poor, and I thought it was a couple interesting things he said on one in terms of giving. He says, Gregory makes a stunning point on the ambiguities of giving to those derelicts among the poor who are by consensus generally regarded as less worthy. One should not just give to the unworthy poor, but also to the worthy poor, regardless of their moral condition, and for a profound reason, because one gives of his bread to an indignant sinner not because he is a sinner, but because he is a man. In doing so, one actually nourishes a righteous beggar, not a sinner, for he loves him not in his sin, but his nature. So I thought that was really interesting. And the other thing he talks about in terms of those that have a lot and are hoarding it, says Gregory proposed a specific approach to the counsel of the compulsively withholding person who says, I've done nothing wrong. I'm not hurting anyone. I'm just holding on to what I have. Such a person needs tactfully to be instructed that charity for the poor is not merely an act of mercy, but also a matter of justice. When we administer necessities to the needy, we give them what is their own, not what is ours. We pay a debt of justice rather than do a work of mercy. To the compulsive withholder, Gregory tells the story of the barren fig tree. It did not harm anybody else, but it did in fact take up ground. The axe will be laid to such a tree, as John the Baptist remarks, if it does not produce fruit.
Good stuff, man.
So, anything else? One thing I will say on complacency, you mentioned mentoring. I think it's really important for us that value the life of the child and the child being born versus being aborted, to recognize the importance of mentorship and to recognize the reality that a lot of abortions take place at the counsel of someone else. So this means that they are being counseled by someone who is advising them to give an abortion. And as if you're a teenager or a young person and you've just gotten pregnant and it's overwhelming and you feel despair or depression, you're going to be influenced by the people that you look up to and the authorities in your life. And this is why I think mentoring is so important, is because when that moment happens, these women are going to turn, these women and men, because sometimes these abortions are pressed on by the man for the women to do it. And there's, examples of that where I know someone who her husband pressed her to have an abortion and she would not do it. And she didn't relent. But some people may relent and they may regret it later. But if we're mentoring and we're making disciples, as Christ called us to do, then we're going to be in those situations where decisions are made, and we can have an influence on that. And so I think mentoring is a really important factor in terms of addressing it. It's a very small level, but it's also something we can all do. It's something we can play a role in with our neighbors and our community and our church and school, wherever it might be that we think is most appropriate to do so.
Yeah. That phrase, "It takes a village to raise a child," is there for a reason. It's not just one party or even two parts.
Because each of us is only going to have a part, and as a group we can fill the gaps. So
yeah. A total aside here, people are afraid of strangers because of stranger danger type stuff in terms of it takes a village to raise a child, so you don't want strangers near your child. But it makes me think of people that are atheists that have no belief in God, but they are fully recognizant of the evil demons that are out there in the world, that are causing this sort of disarray, this stranger danger, pedophiles. We even just saw it in the Balenciaga ads, the evil that was trying to be perpetrated kind of subconsciously almost until somebody called them out on it. Um, so I guess the village is essentially being targeted. And so when you can't even develop a relationship to strangers, you're kind of forced to have a nuclear perspective on everything. Like, how does this benefit me? How that person over there is looking at me weird, so he or she must be something weird. There's a kind of a massive targeting of people that I think everybody could agree with, and so that creates a power vacuum that inherently makes this abortion issue that much more harder. Fathers are being targeted. The definition of a man is being targeted, or a woman. Um, I know there was something I heard recently that one of the LGBT groups wanted to rename breastfeeding to chest feeding because it was more appropriate in their perspective. So it was inappropriate to say breastfeeding. So all sorts of targeting is going on that I just want to put that complacency thing.
Yeah, it's kind of a questioning reality. What is reality, and is it? And that kind of goes back to is there a transcendent morality, or is it just my own morality? Um, and are we are we shaping reality, trying to make it what we want it to be, or are we sort of harmonizing ourselves with what reality is? Um, and I'm also reminded by this is another passage I think that really kind of leans into those ideas in terms of vision versus threats and the difference. So for McIntyre, contemporary liberalism, heavily influenced by the social contract theory of Thomas Hobbes and John Locke, is far too concerned with managing threats, internal and external, from its perceived enemies rather than advancing a positive vision of the common good. The limitation of this perspective is that, as Perot Sassian neatly puts it, by keeping only to the perspective of what is evil, we run the risk of dangerously narrowing our range of vision. So by being in a defensive threat posture, we go blind. Mm-hmm. And when you go blind, then we die, So we need to have vision, and that kind of goes back to the common good and the flourishing of people and individuals and society and families and communities, and how do we move towards that? So that was something that came to mind when you were talking.
Yeah. And what makes that hard is like somebody that does not want to accept principles, like, for example, the Bible. They're kind of going in and blind, like you're saying, and to their own definitions.
If I'm going to define it. Now, the interesting thing is in our society, we're in a Christian society in many ways. So we're all Christian, even if we're not, in terms of the ethics that we inherit. So that's good in sense of it creates some common ground, even for those that might disagree. But when you start to look at societies that don't have those baseline beliefs and assumptions, it does become a lot more difficult.
I don't know, bro. To say we're a Christian society is questionable to me nowadays.
Well, a lot of the ethics that we take for granted are based on Christian morality, and as much as we move away from it, those are still there, and it may be fading.
Think about the sacrificial side of Christianity. 90% of the people I know do not want to be sacrificial.
Yeah.
I could say at a surface level we're Christian.
Ethically, there's a lot of things that are good or bad as a society, but those fade unless we reaffirm them, right? Yeah. So, but what I'm saying is you got to look at a society that is completely unhinged and then compare it to us, and that's where you'll see the types of things I'm describing. So we are unhinged in our own way, but when you compare it to a society that is unhinged from Christianity in a really deep way, there's just a lot of things we take for granted, the left and the right, that those aren't even considerations in some of these other societies. So both in history and other parts of the world. So
one might say we need a carpenter to fix the hinge.
Yes, we might.
I wonder who that could be.
So yes, before we atrophy, we need that to happen.
Yeah. Man, there was so much good stuff there. The passage you read made me think of a hilariously simplified version of mentoring and the value of strangers. That Grant Cardone, that real estate millionaire, brought up. He said, "I teach my children to talk to strangers. Like, do you know how many millions I've raised in capital from strangers? Like, we got this upbringing that is totally skewed
Yeah.
to basically keep people not having wealth because we can't even talk to strangers, you know? So if you grow up with that, how much
Yeah.
harder is it going to be to not even forget about having a business? How could you start a relationship with somebody if you're afraid of talking to them, you know?
Yeah.
So that's under attack. But let's move on. For at the end of each segment here, so at the end of complacency, we're moving on to atrophy. I want to go ahead and bring in Ross to kind of speak to his diagram. That is clearly like 80% complacency now.
Hi guys. Yeah, this is a really interesting topic. I will have to figure out how to fit the rest of it in because you've got so much good info already. Can you all see it? Okay.
Yeah.
Yes.
All right. All right. Do you want me to say any salient points, or just want to move on?
If you wanted to speak to any things that kind of stuck out to you, feel free.
Yeah, I think you guys did a great job of pointing out that we have a decision to make as a culture, which direction we go, whether it's towards our own pleasure and convenience, or appealing to a higher ethic that's established before us, despite what is convenient to us. And a lot of it comes down to that, I think.
That's true. Yeah, man.
All right,
I
head
love the
back
way you
on the set.
simplified that. And our already 50-minute kind of discussion on this, you really broke it down. So
Combo.
thank you. I love the artwork you're putting together there too. Awesome. Glad I brought you in for this, man.
I'll keep it coming here.
Yeah. All right. Jumping into atrophy. So atrophy kind of naturally brings into the question, what is it the child owed? Have we atrophied that muscle of what a child is owed? And the story of the child. What is the story of the mother? Or having their fate completely out of their control, or the perspective of that, right? Having a child kind of deducts you in your perhaps some of your life and your goals. Although I would say there's still plenty of billionaires and millionaires that happen to be mothers. So one could argue that that perspective is not entirely true if you focus and educate. And of course, that's an ancillary service that has to be
Yeah.
provided
I mean,
for
the
education.
experience of a mother in poverty versus experience of a mother in affluence is a different experience in a lot of ways, and I think those ought to be considered as part of this discussion, and also helping to address it.
Yeah. But ultimately, the mother has power over the life of the child, but the child does not have the same. Another thing that kind of came up when I was having intense conversation with you brothers about this stuff, also talked about it to my wife, of course. I tried to even bring a woman who runs a kind of ancillary service, abortion clinic type thing to kind of help a woman to not have those not have an abortion. And talking and getting these more perspectives, I realized this is actually have more of a history that I was not aware of, and the kind of founder of Planned Parenthood had some questionable beginnings that I learned about. Some of the perspectives I was hearing was saying that she actually was into eugenics, which is a form of cutting out people that are not good for society, which so happened to be minorities in the early 1900s.
Or it could
And
be
so,
disabled people. It could be
yeah,
whatever someone might deem as inferior.
yeah.
Yeah.
And when I was getting another perspective on it too, in terms of what was your uh, upbringing like in school in terms of Planned Parenthood, and I won't say this person's name, but she told me that Planned Parenthood would actually visit her school regularly and would want to give them pills, and wouldn't even say what the pills are, and so it kind of is a very questionable way that children are being exposed to something they can't even make decisions about. And this person happened to be black, so it was a lower income black school, majority black. So it kind of made me think of like, I didn't grow up with that sort of thing. I never heard any of my white friends or lighter skinned friends talking about that sort of thing at their school. So it just kind of raised an eyebrow.
Yeah, I mean, and a lot of the abortions do happen in the black community. And think of, like you mentioned, the 63 million. I mean, I don't know what the number is, but a large chunk of those is the black community. And to think how different would that community be if those children had been born, just in terms of its share of the American population, right? So,
Right.
yeah.
Yeah.
I think, just talking about like what is the child owed. I mentioned that quote from Alizak McIntyre. He says, a child is owed a particular kind of family. And so apathy would be they don't have a family, or they have a fragmented family, or they're an orphan would be kind of the worst case scenario. He says a family life with unconditional bonds. So atrophy would be a family life with conditional bonds, where they're only part of the family because maybe they contribute something, or there's some reason, but they're not part of that. Or they're part of so he also says where the parents are able to give the children the attention they deserve. So apathy would be parents who didn't give their kids the attention they deserve. And that's something I think can be true of all of us parents. Like there's probably some areas that I am apathizing, where I have apathied. And then he says to provide the children what they need. And so I think that's a practical application for anyone that's a parent, a grandparent, or a neighbor, or a community, to go, okay, this is what the vision looks like. Where am I failing? Where can I pick up? And also maybe how can I step in to family member or my children's, grandchildren's lives, or wherever it might be, and make that impact. So.
Yeah, all solid perspectives. I think it's okay to go ahead and move on to the guilt section.
Okay.
Because complacency and atrophy kind of connected together on that one.
Yeah, I think we covered a lot of it already. So.
Yeah. All right. So let's take a look. Ross, luckily we didn't make this point too long for you.
Yeah, sorry, I dropped out there.
You're good. So.
Oh wait, that's all of atrophy right there?
Yeah, that's all of atrophy. Yeah.
All right.
We'll keep that one small to give you more space for the rest.
Yeah.
We've kind of been covering a lot of the topics that are really in all four categories. We're just sort of reiterating them over and over, so that's probably part of the dynamic.
Cool. Yeah, that's probably true.
You're not about to draw his pee-pee, are you?
His pee-pee, it's a girl. So
okay. Oh, that's awkward.
There's some more hair.
Okay, there we go. Oh, they take this rando pill. Okay, I get what you're connecting that to now.
Yeah, sorry. Okay, so.
Oh, Planned Parenthood is the PB.
Okay.
Yeah. That's right.
I have connected the dots.
And you said has the value.
Oh, sorry, I unplugged for a second.
It's okay.
Yeah, but I'm dealing with battery issues. It should be okay. I'm good to go though. I'm listening again. Sorry, guys.
You're good. And then you said has the value of life, humans has diminished. It's a pretty powerful way to.
Is that what we were talking about with atrophy?
Yeah.
What is the ode to the child, and then essentially, what are we giving the child? If we're not giving them what they're owed, then they're going to become the type of person that can't be the type of member of society that both flourishes as an individual and helps the society to flourish. And so that kind of gets to Ivan's point earlier about the type of life that's created, and what the consequences of that are for other people. And so if we take those consequences seriously, then we ought to. And this is why I think Christianity is so interesting in terms of addressing this. Is it talks about over and over caring for the orphans and the widows, caring for the orphans and the widows, and that is in many ways our call, right? As Christians, take care of the orphans and the widows, and the orphans, because we need them, we want them. They have something to teach us, and we have something to teach them, and together we can create this flourishing society. And I'm reminded of the early church in Rome. Infanticide was a common thing in Rome. People would have a child, and if it wasn't, maybe they didn't want to have the child, or maybe it was a gender they didn't want. They would essentially go take the children and these babies and put them by the river, and they would let nature take care of them, which would essentially be leaving them to the death. So the Christians saw this, and they just went to the rivers and they started collecting and parenting and these orphans.
Yeah, that's how I spend my Saturdays, is just going to the river and collecting babies.
Going to the river, saving babies. But they didn't have a directive. There wasn't anything that Jesus said or that Paul said or the New Testament said. It was just, these babies are being neglected to die, and we value them. Even though nobody else wants them, we want them. And so they went to them and they saved them. And I think that's the type of mindset I think we need to have in our current society, right? And it's hard, and it's also, we're overwhelmed because it's such a big society that we live in, and there's so many problems, and we're inundated with all the information about it. But we do have a circle of life that we live in. We have a house we live in a neighborhood we live in a community, in a church, and a city, and those are areas we can make a difference. So
yeah, I think something else we've atrophied, I would love that our schools would have a class about, is social etiquette, which is all about treating other people in certain ways, politeness, and how to even have friendships, relationships. We have classes around sex, but we don't even talk about what it means, right? What are the consequences, the responsibility of it? And so I think a social etiquette class would be able to address those sorts of things so we could operate better in society, instead of just kind of figuring out all on our own, like even how to, have a girlfriend. I didn't know how to do that. I had to look up online courses.
Yeah.
Get pirate some courses for myself, which ended up being unhealthy for me, because that was a skewed definition of how to pick up girls and all this stuff. So social etiquette would be good. And it would also help to block off that emotional unhealthiness of, like, I'm going to do things only that benefit me, because this life is all about me, which brings in this abortion topic. How could you even consider what the life of a child is or could mean to you if you're thinking first and foremost about surviving yourself?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the very thing that you might need might be in having that child. In other words, you're in a
that's
survival
a good way to think about it.
place, and it could be the very thing that could change you in a way that could change your situation. I've experienced that in many ways. So it's just an interesting dynamic that this kind of, we can dive into more.
Speak to your experience, bro, because you have definitely speak to your experience on children and family.
Well, I was meaning more of like, well, I do have 5 kids, so I definitely have. I guess I could use that as an example, but more specifically, having who I was before I had children and who I am now. There's now not everyone necessarily embraces that. They can have children and then just sort of ignore it. But if you want to allow it to transform you, that opportunity is there. And so I'm a very different person. Before, we had our first child in 2009. She's 13, and now we have 5 children, and she's 13, and then the youngest is 4. And I have to now set myself aside. So in terms of like responsibility, which is the next part under guilt, is personal responsibility. There are a lot of things I want to do that I would love to pursue that I sort of either have to set aside or slow down or pause because of my children. And there are probably things I should probably do more of that for the sake of my children, and really lean into being the type of father that they need and is ideal for them. But there are a lot of considerations that a lot of sacrifices I have to make to set myself aside. And that's been transformative, but it's also very fulfilling, right? It's a trade-off. You lose kind of maybe those personal pleasures and conveniences that we talked about earlier, but I get something better back. I get something meaningful and deep and long term. And so my 5 kids each have something to teach me, and they're very different personality wise, and so they interact and interface with me differently, and we're at odds and conflict at different levels about different things. And that conflict, when I allows it to be a mirror to see myself, to go, okay, what's going on in me that's surfacing this thing inside of me, this anger or this sadness or whatever it might be. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it also forces you to reflect on, why did I put them in a basement for a week?
Yeah, they like to. We don't unfortunately have a basement, but
you just ruined that joke, Jason.
We do have a Hogwarts room, so they can go in there.
I disapprove of your rebuttal. So it's interesting. Everything depends on perspective, right? Because you just said you kind of had to limit what you did in life for your children. But I look at your life and you ran a dozen person shop, ad agency, marketing agency, while having children. You have transitioned with a 1-year Sabbath to a freelance business that is dramatically fulfilling. And I'm like, what do you mean you have to limit your life? Like, dude, like.
Well, no, that's a good point, because I think it's important to recognize that sacrifice, that's kind of what I was saying. Like, you sacrifice something, and something better is on the other side. And that's where the hope and despair piece comes in that we talked about at the beginning is, do I believe there is something better on the other side? Or do I have despair and that it's only going to get worse? And, it's a hard question to answer, because sometimes things do get worse and sometimes things do get better, and how to navigate that. And sometimes we have to trust. I think it's a trust thing, trusting God, like going back to Ross's point about transcendent. If I believe there's a God and I trust that God, then I can trust that no matter how difficult it gets or what difficulty I go through, there's something better on the other side of that.
Yeah. And that's a powerful position to be, as opposed to, sorry, atheist, I got to call you out again.
Yeah. So I might feel like, oh my goodness, my only choice in this situation is for us to have an abortion.
Yeah.
It's only going to make things worse.
A faith that things will happen because of your relationship with God.
Yeah, because I can trust that
things have happened. Like, Jason, you got to tell the minivan story now, because that was one of your.
Yeah, I mean, that would be an example. We had a situation where we needed another vehicle, or we were having more kids and we had an SUV and it wasn't working. But we had sort of this compelling voice that I thought that I interpreted was God telling us to sell our SUV and that God was going to make a way. And we sold the SUV without knowing what that way was going to be. And we had a friend that showed up at our house like a week later, and they had bought us a minivan and gifted it to us. And so it was just God showing up. And
no prompting whatsoever.
Yeah. So it was just someone that saw the need and acted on it, and they made a difference. And interestingly enough, the SUV we had before that was also gifted to us in another situation prior to that. So generosity's been lavished on us. And so I aim to have a mindset and a system of generosity where I systematically give, both financially but in other ways, as much as I can. I want to give as much as I've been given to, and ultimately that's reflective of my relationship with God, in terms of God giving so generously to me in my undeserved states and bringing me into a better place. Yeah.
So that's another perspective I guess when it comes to abortion, having that faith is kind of hard to have sometimes. That you will be cared for.
Yeah.
Um, and it's
And
not
if
necessarily a
yeah,
guarantee too. That's another scary thing too.
and that goes back, as an example of what is the child owed. They may have grown up in a family where they didn't get that from their parents, and their lack of faith is because of how they were raised, and that was something they were robbed of. And I think, but we have an opportunity to help those people. There's something for them to teach us and something for us to teach them. Perhaps we're naive about just the difficulties and sin of the world, and perhaps they have some generosity to benefit from that we can participate in.
Yeah, one of our close friends in our group that we hang out monthly, the bros, um, that I was surprised to have heard about is that they heard about a woman that was contemplating abortion, and they went ahead and committed to supporting them in whatever they need, babysitting, financially. And I was like, dude, this is just about a stranger that you just met in church, like, and that just shows the generosity that we have been given through Jesus. Um, and I think there's a whole lot more than just that guy that I know in our group
Yeah,
that are doing that are fellow Christians. So it's amazing.
yeah. So, yeah, that's and the guilt piece, right? Is there's a lot of guilt that can kind of surround all of these layers, and that guilt can then lead to shame, and that shame can perpetuate the problem.
Yeah. Yeah, guilt. So that kind of ties into personal responsibility, but it's also what we talked about before. The government not necessarily always having ancillary services to support the person through their struggles, like education, proper education, babysitting, housing, that sort of thing. So my heart goes out to those folks that are groaning day to day about how is that going to happen. Like, I live in a city where $2,000 a month of rent is a regular thing, and I have my job is at McDonald's. I have to, commute 1 hour and pay hundreds of dollars per month just to even get to my job. How am I going to pay rent and a child and X amount of expenses all at the same time?
Yeah, and then if they do have an abortion, they might feel guilt, right? Or if they're even thinking about it, right? I mean, we've all thought about terrible things, so that guilt is a real thing, and sometimes context can push in on us in a way that we feel out of control, or we feel like we have no other choice, and we make the bad choice because, like, two bad choices, I made what I thought was the least bad one,
Yeah.
And so,
Yeah,
how do
I
we
think
approach the issue with grace? I think grace needs to precede judgment. Otherwise, we risk alienating people unnecessarily.
yeah, I think this kind of comes back to, like, also access to critical skills. Like, I haven't even Google searched myself, but if there's a friend of mine that supported somebody to avoid an abortion, there's got to be some organizations in Georgia that are just made for that. Like, if I did a Google search for abortion prevention, there's got to be something that comes up. So having an education around that, access to education around that sort of thing is going to be useful to overcome.
Yeah, we may take for granted that just how people are thinking about it and whether there's even another option available, right?
They might not even have internet to even find the stuff.
So we, I mean, if you just think about when I was a 12, 15, 18-year-old, like, there's just so much I didn't know, I just was unaware of. And so that's a reality that's got to be integrated.
Yeah. So guilt also may tie into, let's say you perhaps got raped.
Yeah.
Or
if you've been victimized in some way, like that, or even other ways, just abuse. It could be physical abuse by your.
Yeah. So how could you look at that child and be reminded of that every day?
Yeah,
right?
And also, like, you might feel guilt to get married, and maybe you shouldn't marry this person, right? Maybe they are abusive, or they're dangerous, or they're toxic in some way. But you feel guilty from a religious standpoint because you're supposed to get married when you have a baby. and so
Right.
you get married when you shouldn't. So that guilt can be a lever for all kinds of bad. One bad decision is like cascading into a bunch of more bad decisions. And that's
Yeah.
where grace, I think, comes in, because it gives us a stopping, kind of stops and go, wait, okay, things are messy, but what's the best thing for where we are now going forward? We can't undo what's been done, but we can at least start to make good decisions going forward.
Yeah, because being stuck in something like that, um, kind of remorse and sadness and depression, is actually uh, against God's will for us. That could easily become handcuffs and could tie us into a fear state to not do anything at all, and just let things become worse. Um, so, if you're actively going through this, first of all, we grieve with you, we groan with you, um, but we want to encourage you not to make decisions based on fear. Make it based on what's going on, like in your heart, and what do you feel God is telling you. Um, what is another form of guilt that people feel? Um, Perhaps if they actually could die, right? Um, but that's also questionable because I've heard stories of doctors telling people they have 90% chance of dying and everything turns out fine. So, um,
Yeah, I think, well, in that case, I don't know if that would be guilt. That'd probably be more fear, because guilt is usually in retrospect, like you're looking back at something
all
you
right,
did or didn't do, versus something that in the future I think would be more fear, fear of guilt, of potential guilt. Um, but guilt is usually, yeah, it's, I think when you think it's like relationally, the wrong person, maybe it's sexual relationships outside of marriage, you might feel guilty about. Not having a child without being married, you might feel guilty about. Considering an abortion, you might feel guilty about. Having an abortion, you might feel guilty about. Um, Someone might not have an abortion and might feel guilty about it because of pressure from people, like from parents or friends or mentors, or the father, or maybe the father is pushing for the abortion, and the mother doesn't want it, and she
yeah,
feels guilty about not doing what he's asking. Um,
might feel guilty about putting him in the river, like the penguin from Batman. So
yeah.
just try to avoid leaving him in the river. That's one way to
Yeah,
avoid
I mean,
that.
if I mean, yeah, we've maybe lying about things might be another reason for, like, the guilt can kind of spiral into other things.
Yeah.
So,
Um,
but
I think those are good.
ultimately, I think that's again another opportunity where we as a friend, as a family, as a community, as a society need to move heaven and earth to fill in those gaps, and that's grace, right? Hey, you may not deserve this, but um, we're gonna step in and fill the gap. So,
Yeah.
and that's where I
Oh,
would love to see
something.
that mindset more prominent. Is, hey, we're gonna solve the problem. We're gonna fill the gap. We have an imagination to do that. We're gonna come up with ways
Yeah.
to do it, and we're not gonna come up with excuses or condemnation. We're just gonna go in and fix things, and that's the entrepreneurial spirit. So I think we should embrace that more so in the in solving some of these problems.
Yeah. Put some feet to those prayers.
Yeah.
Um, and if you need help, go get a good resource for that too. Find those resources; they're out there. Um, I will tie back into something you said before, which is picketing outside of an abortion clinic is not the way because that's essentially like hatred, and people aren't motivated by hatred. So if you feel guilt about that sort of thing, like I want to just remind you, those sorts of people are not actual true Christians. There's something else that they're posing as Christians. Even people that picket against gay people, like the Westboro Baptist Church, they're not actual Christians. That is not the reason God came. He came to love and love hard. Um, yeah. When Jesus talked to people, even in the midst of their sin, he would not even just directly tell them all the time. He would just say, you know, I've healed you. If you want to keep doing this, that's on you and the consequences of whatever you want to continue doing. Um, he didn't have a picket and say, hey, sinners, you're doing bad. Therefore, you should fix yourselves. None of that is of Jesus.
Yeah. Now, I will say there are some people that will go to those lines to love on the people that are going into the facilities. So I think those people are embracing that. But there are also a lot of people that they're looking for that dopamine rush of, hey, I'm against abortion. I went to the line. I had my sign. I feel good because I was against it and I told them I was against it. But they shouldn't feel good because unless it actually affected change in a positive way, they shouldn't feel good about themselves. So that's the kind of my root issue is like, I want to actually bring life and be pro-life, and not just how I feel or the things that I say or the things I want the things I say and do to actually impact and foster flourishing in life. And if they don't, then I don't want to feel good about myself until that happens. So, and that's just whether it's the right or the left, that's our society as a whole right now. There's a lot of sort of virtue signaling. Hey, I'm good because I'm for this or against that, and they do we do a social media post to kind of present ourselves as sort of morally superior. And we get that dopamine rush, but then we really don't care about the issue being solved because we're not doing things to make it to solve it. And so my challenge is that we would evaluate what we're doing and whether it has the effect in a real tangible way, in a measurable way. And if it is, then continue to do those things and do less of the things that are designed to make us feel better about ourselves and to alleviate our own guilt.
Yeah. And I kind of want to backtrack a little bit, saying those folks are not true Christians. Maybe they're just kind of earlier in their faith, because I myself, I think even yesterday, was castigating somebody in a not so loving way because I was passionate about a topic. It was not very effective, particularly because I was kind of passionate about it. But nevertheless, I'm going to try my best to be and approach it in a different way in the future.
Yeah.
Because I guess if you're doing picketing, maybe try a different way.
Or ask why you're doing it, how you're doing it, those types of things, and what the effect is, and is the effect positive? Yeah, I mean, God can certainly use even problematic methods. He does and will use them, but ultimately, we can be wise and strategic in our approaches too.
Yeah. All right. Before we get into escape, let's check back into Ross, who is drawing a Twitter sign apparently.
Hey guys, what's up?
Hello.
That was a good definition of virtue signaling. I had forgotten what that was. People saying on social media, "Am I really? Look how good I am." But I think that's what a lot of this comes down to: is our heart really to change the topic, or are we just positioning ourselves so that we feel good? And again, that comes back to that whole: is it about our own pleasure and convenience? Because that's what we're doing if we're doing some of these actions out of the wrong heart, because it's just doing it to please ourselves. But if we are going back to that original ethic of, am I doing this to be generous to my neighbor? That's what we have to pay attention to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's really good.
For sure, brother. It's looking good. All right, let's jump back into Escape, the last segment. So, if you wanted to escape, I guess, physically, you could move to a different state for an abortion. But
yeah, I mean, I think of abortion, as an escape. It's usually a choice, often as a way to kind of alleviate the pressures that are apparent. But I think it also can mask the root problems, which then can't be solved because essentially they're solved by getting rid of the child, and by having the child, it surfaces the problems. Now, if you're in a situation, I can imagine being in a situation or a context where the problems are surfaced and then they're just continue to be neglected, and that's where despair can come in, and that's a hard one to navigate as well.
Yeah. For me, I was thinking in my head initially that, like I mentioned in first point. If crime is going to increase and we're going to kill more people by people being raised to become serial killers, then why is abortion not viable, right? But when I had deeper conversations, I kind of had a more different perspective on it. Of like, well, actually, crime could be addressed. Ways to reconcile people could be addressed through therapy. And I literally even asked a friend of mine kind of a bold question of like, well, if this Roe v. Wade correlation statistic is true, would you be totally fine with this anti-abortion precedent, meaning that you're essentially your home is not safe? You know, crime will be rampant. Your family would not be safe, and he surprisingly said, "Yes, I'll deal with it at that point." And that was kind of eye-opening for me because I was like, "Why not avoid the issue entirely?" But
Well, that there is an interesting deterministic layer to that, because one, we're kind of acting like soothsayers, saying we know the future when we don't,
Right.
and we're being so determined about it that it's inevitable, right? And so we're not leaving ourselves open to the possibilities, which kind of goes back to the imagination thing. We have a failure of imagination of those possibilities, and so those are a couple things that came to mind. But it's like, again, back to the justification thing. It's like it could also be that we could also just be justifying something, giving ourselves cover so we don't feel guilty, and both the individual and maybe the society should feel some of the guilt, so that it drives and motivates change, as long as it's in a healthy way versus in a manipulative way.
Right. All right. Let me see. To escape from this topic, my final suggestion is if you are actively or in the past suffered the groaning, grieving of this topic deeply, just bring it to Jesus. I'm not saying you did anything wrong or you need to correct yourself. I'm just saying let it out of your system by claiming your grief to Him, transferring it to Him because He can handle it, thereby increasing your ability not to be withered down, deteriorated as a person by it. Jason, what are your kind of final thoughts on this?
Yeah, I'd like to. Well, I definitely affirm what you said, and I think if we realize, one, we're not alone. Christ is with us, even when we feel alone. He is there, and people want to help too. So I think it's not just a spiritual layer, but I think people want to help. They are there. We are there. And if you don't have that, then that's something that I would encourage you to seek out through a church, through your community, through your neighbors, through a friend, to extend that hand that says, "Hey, I need help." And the other thing I would want to put into the conversation is this idea of reductionism, and this kind of goes to the justification piece. But reductionism is I'll quote from this article on the Velcro Tabernacle. Reductionism attempts to reduce the whole into constituent elements due to the assumptions of a closed system and alienate it from end goals, and therefore preclude from examination other variables which may be a factor. So what does that mean? That means, this isn't a baby. They're just a clump of cells, right? Reductionism is to sort of take the person and just split them into their pieces to a level that it makes it fine to get rid of it, right? It's just a clump of cells, so we'll get rid of it. That's reductionism. And so reductionism is a way that humans explain things so that they can be more comfortable with uncomfortable things. And so it makes, and that's often what happens in genocides, is they start to talk about them as animals and dogs and vermin, particularly with the Jews and the Germans. So I think we have to be careful about this reductionistic language. It can, when you're thinking of something scientifically, there is a point of reducing things to its parts so you can understand it, but the purpose is to understand it and to make sense of it. It's not to reduce it so it makes my action tolerable. And so I think reductionism is something that gets integrated into a lot of the conversations. but it loses the personhood, and it kind of goes back to what is a person worthwhile? Are they of value? And where does that value come? Is it based on whether they are wanted, or does it come from a transcendent layer? And so I think going back to that, is there a transcendent plan? Is there a transcendent God? Is there a transcendent morality? Or is it just me? Is it me, the individual, that gets to determine what is right or wrong? And then if there is a transcendent, am I actively aligning myself with God and his ethics in my life and in this issue and society? And how am I contributing to the problem of abortion? And how am I contributing to the solutions? And am I moving more towards solutions contributions and less away from problem contributions, or am I doing the opposite? And where in my life can I make those changes to alter that trajectory? Does that make sense?
Yep. Basically, jump into some critical thinking skills to really assess what's going on.
Yeah, and the thing I would also add is, I think we should have gracious relentlessness. We should be making incremental progress towards the end game, caring about the lives and not the legalities, the actions and behavior and not the public proclamations.
What just popped in my head was one of the requirements of, I guess, the end times is actually, I think, filling up the earth with people. And so
I mean, in Genesis, it does say, go and populate the world. And God, when the Tower of Babel happened, God, he confused them so that they would spread out and start moving around the world and populating it. So that's something that I think is really important to God is, I think of the Trinity as a community of God and three in one. It's a community, and out of that community of love came humanity. Humanity is an expression of God's love. And I think God wants a really big family, and we all get to play a part in that.
Yeah. And so I'll just leave it at that. That was a good way to end that. Ross, did you have any final thoughts?
I think just the same as before. What is the ethic that we are prescribing to? One of convenience, or personal convenience, or of a greater ethic that's established outside of our convenience. But then, what do we do about it? How do we act on it? Now that we've seen what we should do from this outside ethic that's bigger than our own convenience and pleasure, how do we change our lives and make progress towards the people around us, the people who carry guilt, and the ones who are maybe throwing guilt? And what is our action steps in regard to, will we be obedient to this higher ethic?
Amen, brother. If you feel like we need to make this more of a community conversation, we're open to that. If you know of any experts on both sides of the equation who want to speak to this on maybe a subsequent episode, just throw it in the comments. I'll reach out to you, and we could make this more of a community conversation, because again, this conversation is more about adding perspective, not limiting and making people feel guilty about their perspective. We operate with love first and foremost. And if you didn't feel that way, we apologize in anything we said today. We absolutely love you and know that you're going to be the best version of yourself if you're not already that person. This has been another episode of From Pain to Gain. Thanks for joining us. We love you. Have a blessed day.
Cut.